2019 was a big year of endings in pop culture. Avengers Endgame wrapped up the 11-year Infinity Saga in the MCU, Game of Thrones and the Star Wars Skywalker Saga both reached their grand finales, but for DC fans, 2019 was the year the Arrowverse finally delivered a crossover it has been teasing for 5 years. Crisis on Infinite Earths has come and gone, and unlike some of 2019's other huge finales, it actually lived up to the hype. Arrowverse fans have known a crisis was coming since the debut of The Flash in 2014, but only in the months leading up to the crossover did the scope and ambition of this crossover become apparent. Not only does Crisis bring together all the prime movers of the Arrowverse, but it also forges direct links to numerous other live-action DC shows and movies. It's a testament to the crossover's execution that Crisis manages to tell a coherent, stirring tale of death and rebirth, even as it juggles a, frankly, ridiculous number of moving pieces. Conceptually, Crisis is very similar to the 1985 comic that inspired it. Both revolve around the heroes of many parallel universes banding together to help the Monitor stop his polar opposite, the Anti-Monitor, from wiping out the entire multiverse. Where past Arrowverse crossovers have dealt with the fate of one world, Crisis ups the ante exponentially by putting all worlds on the chopping block. At the same time, the TV version isn't afraid to make significant alterations or jettison major characters from the comic who don't further the overall narrative. Hardcore comic fans may be disappointed at the absence of characters like Psycho Pirate and Alexander Luthor, but cuts had to be made somewhere. This take on the Crisis formula wisely tailors itself to those characters who matter most, rather than worrying about being strictly faithful to the source material. It also manages to be reasonably accessible and self-contained despite the months of build-up that took place in shows like Arrow and The Flash. With that in mind, Crisis's greatest success comes in wrapping up the story of the Arrowverse's first hero and namesake. Fans knew coming into Crisis that Arrow was on the verge of wrapping up its 8-season run and Oliver Queen himself was fated to die. The only questions were how that death would be handled and whether it would do justice to a character defined by self-sacrifice and the struggle to become something else. Crisis wastes surprisingly little time in giving Ollie a heroic death, with Part 1 culminating in the character sacrificing himself to save the fleeing refugees of Earth-38. Part 2 threatens to muddy those waters a bit, pivoting to a story where Ollie's daughter tries to resurrect him. Thankfully, Crisis eventually justifies this narrative swerve in its back half, as Ollie temporarily takes on the mantle of the Spectre and is given the chance to be a hero on a far grander and more tragic stage than ever before. Ollie's second heroic sacrifice is even more fitting than the first, ensuring his long, painful journey does indeed wrap up in the manner it deserves. At this point, Arrow doesn't even necessarily need a series finale. While Ollie is in many ways the most important and most fully realized figure in Crisis, several other characters enjoy meaty, compelling arcs. Perhaps the most pleasant surprise of the crossover is Jon Cryer's Lex Luthor. Cryer already impressed in his limited but pivotal role in Supergirl Season 4, but his new status as the lone, self-serving villain among a gaggle of noble heroes gives Cryer even more room to make the character his own. Cryer's Lex is a fascinating and entertaining antagonist. Best of all, Crisis paves the way for Lex to be an even bigger and badder villain in the future. Likewise, Crisis makes strong use of many of its Paragon characters. Supergirl and Flash both find their resilience tested like never before. Barry is annoyingly MIA in the first 2 episodes, but he increasingly moves to the forefront after that. Batwoman really shines in her second crossover adventure, with Part 2 delivering a terrific reunion between Kate and her cousin, a version of him anyway, and forcing Kate to grapple with a larger world and decide what kind of hero she wants to be. Half the fun of watching Crisis is in seeing so many iconic DC characters and worlds drawn into the fray. Many of these cameos are fleeting moments of fan service, but other multiversal guest stars play very satisfying and meaningful parts in the crossover. Part 2 delivers a perfect Smallville epilogue, allowing both fans and Welling himself to bid farewell to the character. Kevin Conroy proves he's a great Bruce Wayne in live action too, even as the character makes an unexpected heel turn. Tom Ellis' brief but memorable appearance as Lucifer practically demands that character find second life as a recurring player on Legends of Tomorrow. Looking back across all 5 episodes, some characters are certainly underserved. As great as it is to see Black Lightning officially inducted into the Arrowverse, Cress Williams has limited screen time in the crossover. It's also a shame we don't see more of Brandon Routh's Superman after Part 2, given how well he fills that role even a decade and a half after Superman Returns. The Anti-Monitor himself is also frustratingly underdeveloped, though, to be fair, the source material is really no better on that front. Crisis's reach also exceeds its grasp at times. On a technical level, the special effects aren't always quite up to the task of depicting this larger-than-life conflict. Part 2 is probably the biggest offender in that regard, as the brawl between Routh and Tyler Hoechlin's Superman is less epic than it is awkward and, frankly, unnecessary. Thankfully, the effects stand out more in other key battles, such as Spectre Ali's battle with the Anti-Monitor in Part 4 and the final showdown in Part 5. On a storytelling level, the crossover does begin to buckle under its own weight in Part 3, as the sheer number of characters jockeying for attention starts to become overwhelming. Crisis wisely gives viewers a bit of a reset after the holiday break, as Part 4 significantly trims the cast and recenters the plot, restoring a sense of narrative momentum that Crisis never again loses. The individual pieces are strong, but taken as a whole, Crisis works that much better. Crisis on Infinite Earths could have failed any number of ways. This is a superhero crossover tasked with bringing together dozens of major characters across numerous worlds, all while working under the constraints of a TV budget and a limited 5-episode structure. And while it does occasionally stumble along the way, Crisis truly lives up to its promise. It's an ambitious crossover that blends heartache and humor and manages to honor the legacies of some of DC's most important TV characters. It's far and away the best of the CW's annual Arrowverse crossovers. For more series reviews, check out what we thought of Netflix's Dracula and the first season of The Mandalorian. And for everything else, subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch.